You're fine. You're good.
Oh, perfect.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for joining. Actually, this is the last and final session of this information forum that we've been hosting. Those of you who had the chance to attend the previous 4 sessions, we started with really discussing the utility concept and enabling legislation, but also really touched on the program needs. How do you define a program? What are the components of a program? And we talked briefly about you don't really need to form a new organization or a new department. You could still handle everything in your existing organizational structure, should you choose to do that. We touched upon policies. So that's what we started with. And that really lays the foundation for then developing what we call the 5-year or a 6-year or a 10-year financing plan that we talked about in the second meeting. We explained the financial planning process, what are the components of a financial plan, why it is done. And then when we came on to the third meeting, we really talked about the policies and also specifically, how it has a bearing on both the financial aspects of the study, but also the technical aspects of the study. And then in the fourth meeting, we really talked about the impervious area analysis, the rate structure, and those kinds of aspects. So that's what we covered in the 4 meetings. And one of the things that you saw in the journey that we have done through the 4 meetings is that while those are all, a lot of it is policy, technical, you really can get to this journey or go through this journey successfully without, some level of engagement, not only engagement within the internal to your organization, but also engagement with the external stakeholders. So in today's discussion, we are kind of going to bring it together where, in addition to all the diligence and technical analysis and financial analysis, how do you really go about engaging stakeholders both internally and externally and really talk about the various facets of engagement? Dana?
Sure. Thanks, Prabha. Yeah. So I think the important takeaway here is that it's really important to start this early and have this targeted and create a stakeholder engagement plan. And we'll go into what that looks like and what the components of that are. But just remember that this is a policy-making process. It's complex. And you're essentially trying to establish this new business inside of a government agency. So it's very, very important to prioritize stakeholder engagement and to be thinking about it throughout the entire process. So let's take a step back. And I like to start with this just so that we're all on the same page in defining the differences here. So a lot of people are familiar with these terms, and often I find that they use them interchangeably, but often they're not really, they shouldn't be used interchangeably. So let's define them. So public notification, this is like you have a project or you have something going on and you literally tell the public, you send a letter, whatever it is, a notice, and say, this is happening. There's no room for conversation. There's no room for input. It's just, this is happening. You should be aware of this. If you have questions, ask us. The next level of that is public outreach. And I think this is where a lot of this is often where people land on projects or policymaking. This is like you have some idea, concept, draft, you maybe present it in a couple of public meetings, or you have a public information session, you get some feedback, you incorporate some of it, and you produce a final document. Public outreach. Stakeholder engagement, this goes beyond public outreach or public notification because it really aims to consider all members of the community. And it starts from the beginning, and it tries to account for all of the voices. And while you may not take into account every comment, every point, every thought that someone has, it's incorporating all of those voices throughout the process. So at the end of the day, when a decision is made, they feel as part of that process, they feel they've brought in or representatives of various communities or stakeholder groups are part of that, and they can feel like their voice was heard. So that's the difference. And I just want to start there. So this is what we're talking about. We're talking about deep stakeholder engagement and consistent throughout the process. So for a stormwater utility feasibility process, I just want to kind of have the different levels here of what would be part of the process. So at the core, we have the project team. This is your internal champion, and we'll say this a few times during the presentation, is identifying that champion. Might be some of you folks on this call or watching this video, you might be the community champion, and paired with your consultant and some of the key players within your municipality, county, utility. That's the project team, driving that from start to finish. Then outside of that project team circle, we can have an internal advisory team, and whether you create a formal team or you sort of identify those players and have them part of the process, that's sort of the next layer. And we'll go into in the next few slides what people and who should be part of these teams. And you also might have like your local stormwater lead or person within your government agency. Beyond that, that's when we bring in the rest of the stakeholder players. You might form an external advisory committee. You might choose to just engage these different key stakeholder groups individually or in different ways, depending on your community. One way might work better, might be the preference. But these are, again, outside groups, and we'll go into who those groups might be. And then in the final layer here, you'll have the general public, the media, maybe some other interested parties. And so throughout the process, we'll be talking about when do we engage these people, how do we engage these people, and who should be part of that process. But ultimately, the project team's at the center of this process, and that includes your project champion. And I will say it's definitely important here to engage folks like your elected officials throughout the process, because you don't want them coming in at the end not knowing what's going on. So elected officials, make sure they're engaged early, as well as the media. They're here on the outer circle, but they can be a really good resource for you. And so bringing them into the conversation and making sure they know who's the resource and where to get information from so that it is correct is important too. And a lot of folks might already have some relationships with those people, or they come to council meetings and report on municipal projects or initiatives. So just remember that they're there and to use them to your benefit. So let's dive into here. So one of the first steps is creating this internal steering committee. So this is beyond your project team. And the folks on this steering committee are going to be critical to information sourcing, to understanding where your financial forecast is going, what kind of projects needs to happen, where are the issues currently in the community, how does the municipality work? So that might include the engineering department, really understanding stormwater, public works. They're often part of the maintenance team for a lot of the stormwater ongoing things that need to happen. Maybe they're street sweeping, maybe they're maintaining storm drains. Planning department, they're thinking about the future, they're writing the master plan, they're thinking about what projects that you're going to do and potentially, trying to get funding for those things. Your MUA or the MIA, the finance billing department. I mean, these people are critical. If you're going to move forward with a stormwater utility, you got to have the finance and billing people in from the beginning. They're going to say, this is how we do this currently. If you have another utility in a municipality, or the utility has that, like, this is how it works. This is the system that we use. This is how we issue bills. So bringing them in the beginning is important. Your environmental commission or a green group or a green team, these people are on the ground. They know the community and they're aware of some of the issues that are going on. Legal, of course, this is very important. There's a lot of ordinances and just logistics that need to happen for creating a utility within the community. So having them there and just aware and able to weigh in when necessary is important. Other internal representatives that you may have in your community, if it's a municipality, they're all different, right? They have different kinds of departments. The departments are structured differently. So this is really, you're sitting down in the beginning and defining what that internal group is going to look like. And then if you have a consultant that you're working with, they would be part of this committee. They would be helping to inform this committee and lead it. So, but at the center of this is a champion. Again, we'll go back to that. Who in your community is going to be the champion for the stormwater utility? Who's going to lead this through and see it through? The champion shouldn't be your consultant. It should be someone internally that is going to work with that consultant to help move everything forward. So then we'll talk about external stakeholders, that next layer, right? So who should be part of this? So it's important here to think about all the representative voices in your community. That could be businesses who will be impacted by a stormwater utility, who's going to, in the end of the day, have to pay the fee. So a lot of, in terms of local businesses, there's retail, there's farmers, which are exempt. Farmland is exempt. Some farmland is exempt under the law. Developers, very important to bring them into the conversation. And Chamber of Commerce, this is someone that could represent a lot of different businesses in your community as well. Local nonprofits, and I emphasize local, and those that are working within that regional or local municipality, county, utility user area. Bringing in statewide organizations are great, but really the local ones are going to know the issues they've been tracking. They might be working on projects, and so making sure those voices are represented. Faith-based organization. Faith-based leaders are some of the best ways to get information out to the public. They have, they meet regularly with their community members and their representatives, their delegation, and they share information. And so bringing them in if they're interested in this process is important. They also own properties within the user area, so that's important too. Neighborhood associations and schools, academic institutions, hospitals, just anything that you can think of in bringing these people in. Some cases, it may be a local resident that is just very active in the community, not necessarily part of a business, and just somebody that's very knowledgeable. And I will say, don't shy away at this point when you're creating this group, don't shy away from bringing in the squeaky wheel, because that person you want to make sure is informed from the beginning. That person might be someone that is open and interested to learning this whole process, and you want their voice to be part of the process, even though that doesn't make it necessarily easy, but it makes sure that at the end of the day, if you're looking forward to implementation, that they're not going to derail the whole process. So bring those people in, teach them, educate them, answer their questions, and put them as part of the process. So I'm going to turn this one over to Prabha. So Prabha has a lot of experience in this, in implementing stormwater utilities. So she's going to kind of walk through, we talk about these different groups, but when each of them should be involved in the different parts of the process.
Great. Thank you, Dana. So this is often the most challenging part. When do you start the conversations with whom, what's the level of messaging? Because the reason we think about it is that starting some messaging too soon to certain groups sometimes might look good, but it's not beneficial because it might actually put you into some challenge. So let's just walk through this a little bit. So the internal group, of course, is involved in everything. So Dana talked about the internal group, the project team with the project champion. They are involved in every step of the process because they are really the doers of this process. So that's why they are involved right from the kickoff meeting stage all the way through all the processes and steps and activities that happen, including the financial technical analysis, any current data gathering and assessment surveys. And then they are also involved in if a utility decides to form a stakeholder, a specific stormwater utility advisory group, it goes by different names. It could be called a stormwater advisory committee. It could be called a stormwater advisory group, regardless of the nomenclature. If a stakeholder group is formed with the representative stakeholder interest that Dana just talked about, if that is formed, then the internal team is actually engaging with them as well, and then soliciting their input, getting their feedback, and then also one or two members of that internal team would also be involved in all the public meetings and information sessions. So that's how the internal team focuses. But really, our focus here today with the specific stakeholder engagement is really, let's talk about the stakeholder advisory committee. Should your utility decide to form a stakeholder advisory committee, whether it is 5 members, 7 members, 11 members, I've had stakeholder advisory committees with 15 members. So depending, whatever the number be, how do you then approach it? There is usually a clamor once people know that there is going to be a study like this that your utility is going to perform, and immediately, and especially when you do a solicitation for forming the stakeholder advisory committee, right then, at least some of the potential volunteers for the stakeholder committee begin to know that this process is going to happen. Then the question immediately becomes, once a committee is formed, there is a bit of a clamor as to, okay, when are you going to start having workshops with them? When are you going to have meetings with them? This is where, from my experience, what we have found is that, you need to give at least 3 to 4 months for the study team, the internal project team, to do some of the preliminary analysis, the financial analysis, the technical analysis, so that they have some preliminary results at least available. Because in the first, and then how do you then structure the stakeholder workshop? Typically, we have seen utilities have 3 workshops. Sometimes they have 4. In extreme cases, we've seen more than that. But by and large, for medium, even to larger communities, 3 to 4 workshops turn out to be ideal, because in the first workshop, you explain the concept of the utility, why you're doing this, the benefits, and really focus a little more on the program. What are your program needs? What are the challenges you're trying to grapple with, and get their input and their feedback, and what are they aware in the community? The second workshop is typically, by then the internal team has completed the revenue requirements analysis, the financial plan. So then you could go talk to them about what is the estimate? What is the program cost estimate that we have come up with? What is the revenue requirement? What does a 5-year horizon look like? The financial plan results, you can present that in the second meeting. And then also discuss with them some of the key policy issues that you may be grappling with, or some of the policy issues that you may have made some preliminary decisions on, and share those preliminary proposed plan with them. And then in the third meeting, typically you talk about the rate structure, the credit program. So if it is a three workshop, you handle it that way. And then typically utilities can use a 4th workshop to get some final recommendation and feedback from the stakeholder team. So that's how typically it runs. So that is why the first 3 months, even though they may be very anxious to have the workshop, you'll have to educate them that you have to take the time to do the internal analysis, so that when they ask some questions, you will be able to answer. So in other words, the internal team always has to be 3-4 steps well ahead with the results, so that you can discuss it appropriately with the stakeholder group. And then that way you can get meaningful feedback from the stakeholder group, and then incorporate it. Sometimes they may give some good ideas. You may have to do another iteration of your financial plan or some rate structure design, and then go back and present it. And then one other thing that always comes up, okay, you've had a stakeholder group. How do you gather information? Typically, what we have seen that works is, typically 1 or 2 members of the stakeholder committee will rise up as the authors, and then they will then write a recommendation report based on everything that they've heard. And then, if there are dissenting opinions, again, to Dana's point, those have to be heard as well. You can't silence them. So we also tell them, hey, in the appendix, you could also have dissenting opinions. At the end of the day, they have to come to some kind of a consensus when they're making a recommendation. So that's really how the Stormwater Committee specifically works. And in my experience, what I've seen is that there are committees that work really well and do give the recommendations, but you have to be realistic with this. One thought I would leave you here is that even when you form a Stormwater Advisory Committee, that doesn't mean that you have the magic bullet to take it forward, because we've seen situations where the utility has done the due diligence of forming a committee. We do the 3 or 4 workshops. The committee makes the recommendation, and it goes to the administration and council, but still the council doesn't want to act. So we've seen that. We've seen in a Midwest community where we had the 3 workshops, they did extremely well together. They not only gave a recommendation, the recommendation was then taken into serious consideration by the council and the city. They actually decided to have a stormwater charge. And then eventually some of the members, 1 or 2 members of the stakeholder committee, also helped to become advocates of the whole process during implementation. So we've seen success stories as well. Right now, I'm working in the southern part of the US, where it started with 4 stakeholder committee meetings. It's gone to 8, and they're really mired in some kind of a paralysis of not making any decisions, and they want more and more analysis. And that's also a risk sometimes you're going to run into. So you also need to know some of the challenges. So I just want to be upfront. And generally, from my experience, what I've seen, if the stakeholder advisory committee are truly, sometimes it works both ways. Sometimes if they do not have elected officials in the advisory committee, it tends to be more objective and works more well and more smoothly. But in some cases, the one that I'm dealing with right now, where they've gone to 8 meetings, there are 3 council members who are part of the stakeholder advisory committee, because that's how that particular community decided to form the stakeholder advisory committee. Not just because of that, but the part of that is also a reason, but they've gone on to more and more analysis and iterations, but just not making any decision, which is not helpful to the utility or to the community. So just be aware that there are also challenges, and you just have to balance it very carefully. Dana, anything I missed or anything you want me to add?
Just maybe the points at which you have an open public meeting when the public comes in, that would be great to just touch on.
Right. So in the open public meeting, there are different ways utilities have done. Some of the successful open public meetings generally have been where, it's not like you just limit it to 2 or 3 in a central location. Generally trying to go where they are is usually useful. Generally, we would have like one or two in the city hall or the community's main area, but then trying to identify some pockets of neighborhoods and then really going there and then setting up, even if it's a disadvantaged neighborhood, but making it a point to go there, have an open house. Typically, some of the things that have been successful is to have like few storyboards. You put it on an easel and then like 5 or 6 storyboards that summarizes the full feasibility study kind of findings, and then be there and have it for an hour or hour and a half, and allow them to come, ask questions, be transparent in really giving them the answer that they're looking for. And sometimes they may ask answers that you may not be able to give right away. Take their contact information so that you can give back, and also have a survey at the end of the open house so that they give feedback. That has really worked well in communities. In some communities, what they do, they actually decide to have an open house in each council person's district. So that every council person's district, you hear from the constituents. So that's one way public meetings are held. But the important thing again, so the question is, when do you do the public meetings? Typically, if you're forming a stakeholder advisory committee, then that committee needs to hear the information first. So you kind of do at least 2 work sessions with the stakeholder committee where you've talked to them about the financial plan, you've talked to them about the policies, you've talked to them about the rate structure so that they understand, you hear their concerns and feedback. Right at that time, probably you're ready to do the 3rd stakeholder workshop, or you just finished the 3rd stakeholder workshop. That's the time to start some public meeting if you also want to have some input from the public. But if you put the cart before the horse, we've had a client who did the public meetings first, never formed a stakeholder advisory committee, then came back and formed a stakeholder advisory committee. You don't want to do things like that. You want to be a little more methodical. If you're going to form a stakeholder advisory committee, to Dana's point, make the decision early on so that it's all about timing, so that you can plan your timing well, and then logically go on to as a last step, go on to the public meetings so that the public then begins to hear the same thing. And one last thing I would say, when you form the committee, many a time we found that, really requesting them, if the stakeholder committee, if you're forming one, requesting them to kind of keep the information to themselves and discuss among themselves is totally fine, and discussing them with the stakeholder group. But generally, we request them not to discuss with the media, because then the media is going to get information from the utility, from the stakeholder groups. It could be conflicting information. It could create a lot of confusion. So generally, we request a stakeholder committee not to start talking to the media, but they very well can talk to their respective stakeholder constituents to get feedback.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I will say, the way that this is kind of stacked is like you have your internal, you start doing your internal review and getting the data and information, and then you start to have those workshops. The stakeholders that you're picking ideally would represent a lot of the voices in the community, represent the public. So if you are able to get a diverse stakeholder group, the reason why you don't have to bring the public in right away is because you're relying on those community leaders, those they could be someone just locally in the community who really understands what's going on. You're relying on those people for information, for feedback, and then you kind of you digest all of that, you take that into consideration, then you move to that public. So it's really important to have these invited kind of stakeholder workshops, but the people that you're bringing to the table are representing the public in some kind of way before you bring it to the public. Open. So let's keep it going here. I'll go over to our next slide. So part of this is a very important part of the process. Probably kind of talked about it, but you have to set ground rules and you have to set expectations for your stakeholder group. Right from the beginning, when they're invited to join the stakeholder group, whatever it might be called, define what their role is, define what they as a company, or so they as an individual will be doing part of that process. What are they there to learn? Are they there to give ideas? Are they there to make a recommendation? Not all stakeholder groups are going to make a formal recommendation, but that might be part of what the community wants. Are they there to just listen? Just really define what their role is in that process. Every community is going to be different. Ideally, they'll be giving feedback and they'll be hoping to make a recommendation and becoming your champions. They'll becoming the people in your community that is working towards building this consensus for the process. So just define that in the beginning. And then at your meetings or before your meetings, set the ground rules and set the expectations. What in the room, how is this meeting going to operate? Ideally, you will have a facilitator there, whether that's the consultant or the champion, somebody facilitating these meetings that are keeping the ground rules in check and making sure that everyone is being heard if they want to be part of the discussion, and then everyone's responsible for enforcing those ground rules, making sure to focus on interest. This can get messy. Like, these conversations can get messy. There could be differing opinions. So having a facilitator there to make sure to bring everyone back and make sure everyone's respectful and on the same page is very important. But sharing these expectations and ground rules ahead of time so that everyone's on the same page is key to help this process move forward. And then, this last bullet point here, trust the process and intent. And just keep continuing to remind people to trust the process. And I think that's a key part of having this go forward with success. So next, we're just going to touch a little bit here on communication. So values-based communications, just making sure you're thinking about that as you're developing your materials throughout the entire process. Like, who's reading this information? If you're having an open public session, what kind of information are you bringing there as you're developing it? Why would it be important to the community? What is the end goal here? Is there any background information, historical information? Like, did this community suffer from significant flooding 2 years ago from Hurricane Ida? Or, just going in, knowing that information, knowing where these people are coming from, what they may have experienced, how something might make their lives better, and really understanding what they care about. That's important. So just going over to our next slide here, this is a resource that I like to show and I like to use a lot. It's language determinants, but it really helps with writing narratives. So your target audience, know your target audience. You have to know your target audience. And in a stakeholder group, there may be a representative of a lot of different types of these folks: science, business, media. So, when you're speaking to a scientist or an engineer, you might want to highlight uncertainty. They understand percent error, whatever it might be. Whereas if you're speaking to someone like the community or the media, highlighting the certainty, what is happened, what is the process. And then compared to the business community, like, they might not care about the uncertainty, but they care about how is it going to impact their bottom line? What is the benefit to them? What is the economic opportunity for this process? So just thinking about narratives, writing them based on values-based narratives is very important and really key to effective communication. And this can be applied not just for stormwater utility, process, but for any kind of communication process. Just using the terms and the language that is familiar to someone, it means that the conversation you're having will resonate with them better. So this is definitely a skill and a process that takes time to master, but just thinking about this in the development of your material and your presentations and how you are putting messages out to the community is very important. So we'll shift over here to some of the tools and strategies for engagement. This is the most important thing. Listen, listen, listen. Like, listen to what people are saying and take that information to account. As Prabha mentioned earlier, you can do surveys, polls, have these open information sessions. It's very important that when it comes to graphics, that it is something that is digestible and readable for the public and for the stakeholders, because I can't emphasize enough coming in with some complicated graph that nobody really understands, like a flow chart, or so they can see the direct impact or shift in equity or whatever it is related to stormwater utility, breakdown of land use. Just make it very clear, put the time into making sure those are readable and digestible for folks. You might have, the world these days is very digital. So thinking about a web portal where you can put all of the information, or a web page on your municipality or county or utility page. If the way that your community likes to receive information is via social media or email blast, leverage those networks, leverage what works best in your community and how people are receiving that information. Use that for this process as well. And then I can't emphasize the last one enough: give food at meetings, because if you're going to a meeting at 5 o'clock and there's no snacks, I mean, come on, man, like let's bring some food if you're able to do that. If you're not able to, that's okay, but it definitely draws people in. If you're, especially at an open public meeting, if you're having it during dinner time, and maybe it's a community where, you know, dinner might be hard, so you can provide that, it might encourage people to show up as well. Food definitely brings people places. So these are just some tools that you can use. For virtual meetings, there are things like Google Jamboard, another type of whiteboard things that you can use to gather information. On the polling side, there's anonymous polls that you can use, like Mentimeter, which is like live polling, or SurveyMonkey, which maybe it's more of a long-term survey. So just think about all the tools in the toolbox that you have and use those definitely for engagement. So as Prabha mentioned earlier, go to the people directly. I can't say this enough. Go to the people, go where they gather. Go to the people, go where they gather. If you have a large city and you have a public meeting at your city hall and it's a 30-minute public transportation commute for the public to get there, they're not coming. Go to where they meet, because you'll have better engagement, you have better attendance, and you'll have people who are interested because you're coming to where they live, you're coming to their part of the community, you're showing your interest in them. So just make sure that when you're creating your strategic stakeholder plan, that you plan the time, the meeting space, the energy to have those meetings in those places. Prabha mentioned earlier, going to every district, having a meeting in every district. If your community is that large, that might be something that you do. If your community is small and city hall is in walking distance, that might be fine. But just thinking about your community and what works best and who those groups are, that could help you with meeting spaces and places to gather. And then also, you don't have to always create these meeting spaces yourself and events, but if there's like a Chamber of Commerce that's having a meeting and there's a bunch of businesses there, maybe there's an opportunity for you to come and present at that meeting. So attend these types of different meetings that all are already happening and use it as a place to share information at the right point in your engagement strategy. I mentioned this earlier, just using trained facilitators, especially in stakeholder workshops and public meetings, like very important. It's public policy making process. It can get messy. So just making sure you have someone that could pretty much almost serve as an unbiased person in the conversation and help navigate the different opinions and thoughts there. And we mentioned earlier, just leveraging relationships with reporters as the champion. Make sure that you're creating that narrative and you're giving the information, that they know that you're the person to come to for that information, so that, you know, there's not 1,000 people talking to a reporter and getting 6 different stories. So that's definitely very important. And then just having like your experts there to answer the questions. The champion should still always be the champion in the process. And all of these meetings, the champion should be there and the experts are there to support the champion, answer the questions, present some of the technical information, but the champion should still be leading that process. And then once again, listen, make sure to keep everyone informed, meet with the key stakeholders. If, you know, they're not able to come to a workshop, maybe you need to have a phone call with them. Maybe you need to go grab coffee with them. If they're a really important part of the process, make time to talk to them about it. And this can be you, it can be the consultant, it can be maybe you have a nonprofit partner that's working with you on this process, on the stakeholder part, but just making sure that you're having time for that. And you know, give all of the stakeholders the attention that they need. And I think the most important thing here to take away is that stakeholder engagement, true stakeholder engagement, it takes time, it takes energy, it takes, you know, planning to make sure that you have a really good process. And you have to also be adaptable in that process as well as things are changing. But remember to plan for that time. If you're putting out an RFP and you want the consultant to attend multiple stakeholder workshops and provide information, plan that, write that in there. Make it also can be, expensive. So if there's a chance for a nonprofit to lead that part of the process for you in your community, and they have a really good reputation and they're great at stakeholder engagement type of things, bring them into the process, get creative with that process, but make sure that you're putting time for that. And at the end of the day, I think what it comes down to is that you know your community best. You know what works in terms of engagement strategies, how to reach them, what methods of communication they prefer to receive information. Apply all of that you've learned and over the years and put that into this process and create that stakeholder engagement plan that works best for your community. So Prabha, if you'd like to add any examples of maybe a community that really it worked well or didn't work well, I think maybe we have time for a quick story and then we can go to questions.
Sure, maybe I'll just give a couple of examples. One community where in the East Coast where they did not have an explicit stakeholder advisory committee, but once all the internal groundwork was done, they did go directly to public, meetings. And so how they did. So this example is Newark, Delaware, a smaller community. It's a university town. So, and one thing to remember there, Dana talked about important stakeholder. University of Delaware owns about 1/3 of the impervious area in the town. You can imagine the impacts and stuff. So what they did was they didn't want to spend a lot of money on Stormwater Advisory Committee because their community was relatively small. And so they decided to go with this approach. But what they did was, after we did all the initial work and everything, they confidently held actually 3 council workshops. So they actually had council workshops. They advertised it heavily. And every time the chamber was full and the presentation was done to the council members in front of the public, of course, the public they were given some opportunity to ask questions through the regular process. And so they did it that way. And then they ended up, instead of 3, finally we ended up having 5. But that's how they did. Each one was like 3 hours. The last one was almost 4 hours. And then through that process, then once they knew that there was not a whole lot of opposition, but there was definitely a lot of interest and a lot of questions, then at that time, before the last public hearing kind of a meeting was held, that's when they decided to do the workshops in the public, in the community. They did one in in a senior center. They did one in 3 different parts of the town, and using storyboards and stuff. But what they also did ahead of that time, they actually had a video. They took the time to create a video with their own staff, where the staff walked through the city community, and they talked to some people. They also talked about their program, what are the needs are, showed them examples of how a capital project actually benefits. So they took the time to do the video. They actually created a campaign, and they created a web portal, and they posted it. And then they also gave the benefit of, with the information, with the impervious area analysis information that we had done, they actually created a quick web portal where customers, potential customers, could go in, put their parcel ID. They can look at that basic information, what the charge may look like. They took that little bit of effort to do that using their own internal GIS staff. By doing all this, a video, giving an interactive portal so that people can go check what their potential charge may look like, and then doing these open houses, even though they didn't have a stormwater advisory committee, they were able to successfully get a stormwater fee passed by the council. And the council took the 5th meeting ultimately to have the courage to pass it, but the council did. This community is interesting because they tried it 3 years before that. They tried without going through this formal process and proper diligence, and they were not successful. The council basically was against it. And here, going through this process, the council actually voted for it. And this is an MS4 community. They got the fee passed successfully. And the benefit of that they saw within the next year. In this community, to do a bond, they have to go through a voter referendum. Because they had the stormwater fee implemented and they knew there was a revenue source, they were able to go issue a bond the very next year for an important major capital program on a project to alleviate flooding in one major part of the community. So that was a very good story where they did not have a stormwater advisory committee. The other one is an example from the Midwest where they did form a stormwater advisory committee. They had, like I said, they had 3 meetings. They had about 17 representatives, and it was very thoughtfully formed by the city manager, reached out, solicited. They got all walks of life kind of representation, and they worked very cohesively together, and they did recommend. There were some dissenting opinions that they documented, but ultimately the stakeholder committee came together, recommended it. The council reviewed it. They had a council retreat to share the findings of the stakeholder committee meetings and everything. And then finally, they were able to successfully get the fee program launched. This was Springfield, Ohio. More locally, the large one, Philadelphia Water Department, they've gone through the same kind of a process. They've formed advisory committee twice. Once they formed it for transitioning to the impervious area-based charge itself, but they also, after the fee was launched, 2 years into launching and implementing the stormwater charge, there were some concerns about the credit program. So Philadelphia Water Department formed an advisory committee for just the credit program, and we walked them through the whole policies, the credit program framework policies, got their input, and actually the credit program was slightly modified based on that stormwater stakeholder feedback. So there are some very good success stories. Dana?
Thank you for sharing that with us. I really appreciate that. So I think we have some time here. We'll open it up to folks' questions. Where Prabha and I are here for the whole time. So we'd love to hear your questions, and turn it back over to Micah.
Yeah, so either put it in the chat and I can read them aloud, or use the hands up emoji or raised hand emoji.